Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. December 20th, 1944, Luxembourg City. The telephone line trembled with barely contained tension as General Omar Bradley clenched the receiver, knuckles bleaching against the cold black bakelite. On the other end, Dwight Eisenhower's calm, unwavering voice cut through the crackle, carrying an order that would strain the bonds of their friendship to the breaking point. 2 American armies, the 1st and the 9th, were to be placed under British command, under Montgomery's command. By God, I cannot be responsible to the American people if you do this. Bradley's Missouri composure finally snapped. I resign. Eisenhower's reply was as icy as it was precise. Brad, I, not you, am responsible to the American people. Your resignation, therefore, means absolutely nothing. Bradley hesitated, offered one final protest, and then silence fell. A quiet echo amid the storm of Hitler's Ardennes offensive. That single moment, buried in the chaos of winter 1944, crystallized 3 years of simmering American frustration with a British field marshal who seemed determined to prove he alone could win the war. Bernard Montgomery, hero of El Alamein, Britain's shining military star, had become the most polarizing figure in the Allied command. Yet the question gnawed at every American headquarters from Tunisia to Germany. Why did a coalition, united against Nazi tyranny, fracture not under enemy fire, but under the weight of one man's personality? The answer was not a single incident. It was a tapestry of clashes, decisions, and simmering tensions stretching from the sands of North Africa to the mud-soaked fields of northwestern Europe. This is the story of how brilliance became a burden, how national pride collided with Allied necessity, and how Americans came to regard their most prominent British battlefield commander with emotions ranging from weary exasperation to near loathing. The arithmetic of Allied command was deceptively simple, yet politically fraught. By late 1944, American forces in Europe outnumbered the British by significant margins. American industrial output dwarfed Britain's war-weary economy. Yet Montgomery seemed constitutionally unable or unwilling to recognize these realities or adjust his behavior accordingly. To the Americans, Montgomery embodied everything they had fought a revolution to escape: aristocratic hauteur, colonial condescension, and an unshakable belief in British superiority. But Montgomery was no cartoon villain. He was genuinely brilliant, methodical in preparation, painstakingly careful with his soldiers' lives, earning loyalty and admiration from those who served under him. His victories were hard-earned, his tactical instincts sharp and undeniable. For British soldiers battered by early defeats, he was a commander who could win battles without sacrificing legions. Winston Churchill adored him. The British public revered him. None of this mattered to American commanders, who found themselves repeatedly sidelined, patronized, and publicly diminished by a field marshal who seemed to see them as enthusiastic amateurs in need of British guidance. The friction was not born of strategy alone. It was personal. Respect, or the lack thereof, was the tinder that ignited tension. From their first encounters in North Africa to the final triumph in Germany, American generals would learn that Montgomery's treatment of them revealed assumptions about American competence, courage, and worth. That cut deeper than any clash over plans or terrain. March 6, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The desert wind carried the acrid tang of burnt vehicles and the bitter scent of defeat as Lieutenant General George S. Patton stepped off his plane, assuming command of the shattered II Corps. Just 20 days earlier, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had decimated American units in their first major engagement with seasoned Wehrmacht troops. The defeat was total, humiliating, and brutally instructive. What Patton encountered was more than a demoralized army. It was a British command that regarded American forces as unreliable auxiliaries, in need of careful oversight. General Sir Harold Alexander, newly appointed commander of the British 18th Army Group, overseeing all Allied ground forces in Tunisia, had produced a report on American combat performance that read more like a legal indictment than military assessment. In Alexander's view, American commanders were inexperienced. American troops were undisciplined. American units required extensive British oversight before they could be trusted with anything resembling significant responsibility. The critique was not entirely unfair. Kasserine Pass had exposed genuine flaws in American leadership, tactics, and combined arms coordination. Yet Alexander's response went well beyond corrective criticism. In his estimation, Patton's Second Corps was to be assigned supporting roles, while British forces carried out the primary attacks. Patton grasped immediately what was at stake. This was not merely a contest against Rommel's forces, it was a proving ground for American arms, a test of whether they could operate as equals alongside the British. His diary from this period captures the simmering tension, recording British presumption and his own determination to demonstrate American worth through bold, aggressive action. At the center of this tension stood Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British Eighth Army as it advanced from the east. The victor of El Alamein carried himself with the confidence of a man who had single-handedly reversed Britain's fortunes in the desert. He had driven Rommel across North Africa with methodical, meticulously prepared operations, relying on overwhelming material superiority rather than flashy maneuvers. His troops trusted him because he won battles while sparing lives wherever possible. Yet his manner suggested that he alone grasped the true nature of modern warfare, and that everyone else, particularly Americans, had much to learn. Alexander's operational plan for the final Tunisian campaign reflected this hierarchy of assumptions. Montgomery's Eighth Army would strike the Mareth Line, the Axis fortifications in southern Tunisia, delivering the main blow. Patton's Second Corps would conduct supporting attacks drawing German attention away, shielding the British while they seized the glory of breaking through to Tunis. On paper, the plan made sense. Montgomery commanded battle-hardened troops who had proven themselves against German armor, while Patton's formations were still learning the harsh lessons of combat. Yet the implications extended beyond tactics. The plan codified a pattern that would haunt American commanders for the rest of the war. British forces would lead, Americans would follow. British commanders would receive the accolades. American achievements would be minimized or ignored. Patton launched his offensive toward El Guitar on March 17, 1943, intent on proving American competence through bold action. His orders were a reflection of his own personality. Tactical guidance intertwined with demands for aggressive leadership. Officers were to lead from the front. American troops were to display the same fighting spirit that had defined their forebears in the First World War. No matter the cost, Second Corps would show it deserved recognition as a fighting force, not mere occupation troops. The Battle of El Guitar vindicated Patton's approach. On March 23rd, 50 German tanks from the 10th Panzer Division emerged from the mountain passes, executing a dawn attack aimed at crushing American defenses. What happened next astonished the Germans. Carefully emplaced American artillery unleashed devastating concentrations on the advancing armor. Tank destroyers exploited terrain to negate German tactical superiority. By the day's end, the valley was littered with wrecked German vehicles, and the 10th Panzer Division had been halted in its tracks. For the first time, American forces had defeated experienced German armored units in sustained combat. Yet, victory tasted bittersweet. Alexander's headquarters, focused on Montgomery's assault on the Meredith Line, paid little attention to Second Corps' success. British staff officers continued to micromanage Patton's operations, signaling persistent doubts about American capability. Worse, Alexander repeatedly shifted Second Corps' objectives: advance, halt, attack with armor, lead with infantry, disrupting operations, and reinforcing the notion that American forces existed primarily to support British plans, not pursue independent objectives. When Montgomery finally attacked the Meredith Line on March 20th, his initial assault faltered against determined German resistance. Adapting, he executed an outflanking maneuver, a display of operational flexibility that had defined his best campaigns. But the adjustment required time, giving German forces the chance to establish new defenses. Meanwhile, Second Corps continued its supporting attacks in central Tunisia, steadily advancing, seizing objectives, and inflicting casualties. Yet these achievements were barely noted in British reports. Montgomery's breakthrough dominated the headlines. Patton's equally vital contributions were largely ignored. The victory parade in Tunis on May 20, 1943, brought Eisenhower, Alexander, and French General Henri Giraud to the reviewing stand. The narrative celebrated British and French accomplishments, while American contributions received only cursory mention. For American commanders, Tunisia offered a lesson beyond tactics and logistics. Fighting alongside the British meant fighting for recognition as well as for victory. They learned that Montgomery, brilliant though he was, could not or would not treat American forces as genuine partners. It became clear that this attitude reflected not only Montgomery's personality, but a broader British reluctance to accept that the alliance's balance of power had shifted irrevocably toward Washington. These lessons would prove prophetic as the Allies turned their attention to Sicily, July 10, 1943. Gulf of Gela, Sicily. The largest amphibious assault in history to that point surged toward the island shores. Operation Husky, the invasion of Italy's largest island, commenced under darkness and in the grip of tumultuous seas, heralding a new chapter in the Allied campaign. Over 8 divisions, split between General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army and General George Patton's American 7th Army, surged toward Sicily's shores, landing from Cape Scaramia to Syracuse in an operation that would test Allied unity as fiercely as it tested German and Italian defenses. Operation Husky had been contentious from the start. Early plans envisioned landings spread across the island, seizing ports quickly to secure supply lines for the forces that followed. Montgomery loathed dispersed landings. His hard-won experience in North Africa had taught him a harsh lesson. Scattering troops invited disaster, and concentration of force was the key to success. On April 24, 1943, he laid out his objections in detail, proposing instead that all landings be concentrated in Sicily's southeastern corner. 8th Army would have a clear mission: drive straight to Messina, the island's northeastern port and the gateway to the Italian mainland. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder and Admiral Andrew Cunningham, overseeing air and naval operations, opposed Montgomery's plan. 13 Axis airfields would remain operational, they warned, posing unacceptable risks to the invasion fleet. Concentrating ships in a single area would render them vulnerable to air attack. Their objections were weighty. Both men commanded respect, earned through hard-won victories. Montgomery's response revealed the full force of his character. Backed by Churchill, he threatened to resign, rather than execute a plan he considered fundamentally flawed. The crisis threatened to unravel the entire invasion, prompting Eisenhower to convene a conference on May the 2nd to resolve the dispute. The meeting exposed cracks that would widen over the course of the war. Montgomery argued his case with confidence verging on arrogance. Tedder and Cunningham pressed the hazards of airfields and naval vulnerability. Eisenhower, navigating the fraught intersection of military necessity and coalition politics, ultimately sided with Montgomery. Landings would be concentrated in the southeast, 8th Army driving to Messina, 7th Army protecting its left flank. For Patton, reading the final plan from North Africa while preparing his command, the message was unmistakable. 7th Army would play a supporting role. Montgomery would lead the main attack, take Messina, and bask in the glory, while Americans guarded the flank. Once again, American forces were consigned to secondary missions while British commanders pursued recognition and credit. The decision rankled for more than just reasons of pride. By July 1943, American forces in the Mediterranean had grown formidable. 7th Army consisted of 3 infantry divisions, an armored division, and extensive support troops, a force comparable to 8th Army. American industry had flooded Allied stockpiles with equipment. American air power dominated Mediterranean skies. Yet the command structure treated them as auxiliaries under British discretion. Patton's diary entry from July 12th captured his frustration in unvarnished terms. Alexander and his entirely British staff had presented the operational plan to 7th Army headquarters, effectively cutting Americans off from any possibility of taking Messina. "What fools we are," Patton wrote bitterly, noting that Alexander commanded both British and American armies without a single American officer on his staff, a political and operational slight he could scarcely tolerate. The landings themselves proceeded reasonably well, despite chaotic airborne operations that scattered British and American paratroopers across the countryside, some drowning when their gliders plunged into the Mediterranean. By dawn on July 10th, both armies had secured beachheads and were pushing inland. Italian coastal divisions crumbled, while German counterattacks on Geller Beach, where Patton's forces had landed, were repelled through a combination of naval gunfire and determined resistance by the 1st Infantry Division. Montgomery, confident that Axis resistance would collapse under methodical British pressure, signaled Alexander that the route to Messina lay open. 8th Army would drive up the eastern coast. 7th Army should hold defensively, protecting the flank while Montgomery's forces delivered the knockout blow. The signal revealed his assumptions. British forces would earn the glory, American forces would provide security. Reality, however, intruded with harsh clarity. German forces, far from collapsing, entrenched themselves in Sicily's mountainous terrain. 8th Army's advance stalled south of Catania, where German paratroopers held positions channeling British attacks into deadly killing zones. Montgomery's methodical desert-honed approach faltered against defenders who could concentrate forces on narrow fronts and fight from prepared positions. On July 12th, as 8th Army's progress bogged down, Montgomery sent a signal to Alexander that would define Anglo-American relations for the remainder of the war. He proposed expanding 8th Army's operational area westward, effectively seizing a critical road assigned to 7th Army. This expanded frontage would allow Montgomery to outflank German positions, but at the cost of halting American forces while British troops executed the offensive that would cut Sicily in two. The tone of Montgomery's signal was as revealing as its content. He did not ask Alexander's permission. He informed him of his intentions and suggested that American forces adjust accordingly. The presumption was staggering. Montgomery was proposing to appropriate American operational areas, relegate 7th Army to static defense, and execute a strategy designed to ensure that British forces alone would claim credit for Sicily's conquest. Alexander, whose admiration for Montgomery far outweighed his confidence in American commanders, agreed. On July 13th, he issued an order assigning Montgomery the disputed road and instructing Patton to hold defensively while 8th Army advanced. For the American commanders reading the order, the message was unmistakable. British preferences would dictate Allied strategy, regardless of American contributions or capabilities. Patton's initial response illustrated the political constraints that frustrated American generals throughout the war. Though furious, his diary likened Montgomery to an arrogant prima donna and Alexander to an incompetent sycophant. Patton formally accepted the order without protest. He understood that Eisenhower, commanding all Allied forces in the Mediterranean, could not tolerate open revolt by subordinate commanders. Coalition warfare required compromise, even when compromise meant swallowing justified anger. But Patton had no intention of allowing 7th Army to sit idle while Montgomery pursued glory. If Alexander would not assign Americans a primary mission, Patton would create one himself. On July 17th, he flew to Alexander's headquarters carrying a map and a bold proposal. Rather than defending passively, 7th Army would drive northwest toward Palermo, Sicily's capital and principal port. The operation promised to cut the island in half, trap Italian forces in the west, and secure port facilities to ease American supply challenges. Alexander, perhaps surprised by Patton's audacity or relieved to see American aggression directed away from Montgomery's operations, approved. The decision fundamentally reshaped the Sicily campaign. Instead of a single British advance up the eastern coast supported by passive Americans, the Allies now executed two simultaneous drives. Montgomery continued pressing toward Messina from the south and east, while Patton raced to Palermo, then planned to swing east along the northern coast toward Messina. What began as a strategic adjustment quickly became a personal competition. Patton, determined to prove American capabilities and reach Messina first, drove his command with characteristic intensity. 7th Army moved at a pace that astonished both allies and enemies, covering rugged terrain at rates Montgomery's methodical approach could never match. Just 12 days after landing, on July 22nd, American troops entered Palermo, seizing Sicily's largest city and a major port. Meanwhile, Montgomery continued grinding against German defenses south of Mount Etna, professional, methodical, and increasingly irrelevant to the campaign's outcome. German forces, recognizing that Sicily could not be held, were already preparing evacuations to the Italian mainland. The question was no longer whether the Allies would conquer Sicily, but which army would reach Messina first and claim the symbolic victory. The race to Messina revealed as much about character as capability. Patton pushed 7th Army to the limits, demanding relentless advance regardless of obstacles or casualties. Corps commanders, accustomed to his style, drove divisions hard. Engineers rebuilt roads and bridges with remarkable speed. Infantry marched through heat and mountains at paces that left support units struggling to keep up. Montgomery's Eighth Army, facing stronger opposition on more difficult terrain, advanced methodically. British commanders, trained to minimize casualties and preserve resources, refused to risk disasters in pursuit of speed. The contrast highlighted fundamental differences in military culture. Americans with vast manpower reserves and industrial strength could accept tactical risk and heavy casualties. British forces fighting since 1939 with exhausted manpower and economy could not. But the race was also intensely personal. Montgomery's statements, both public and private, revealed that he considered Eighth Army's mission more difficult and more important than Seventh Army's. From his perspective, American success in Palermo meant little. Patton had faced weaker Italian opposition on secondary terrain, while Eighth Army confronted veteran German troops in positions that favored defense. American commanders, however, saw Montgomery's dismissal of their achievements as typical British condescension. They had encountered the same attitude in Tunisia. American successes minimized, difficulties attributed to inexperience, and commanders patronized as enthusiastic but untutored. The implication was clear. British respect for American forces was conditional, granted only when Americans operated under British guidance and pursued British objectives. On August 17, 1943, elements of Patton's 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina several hours before British troops arrived. Seventh Army had won the race, but the victory carried a bitter aftertaste, emblematic of the fraught state of Allied command. Montgomery's public response was a mix of graciousness and subtle dismissal. He congratulated Patton while emphasizing the difficulties Eighth Army had faced, implying that terrain rather than American skill explained outcomes. British press coverage reflected Montgomery's perspective almost flawlessly. Reports lauded Eighth Army's determined fighting against the Germans, while treating Seventh Army's advance as a minor sideshow against comparatively weak opposition. American achievements were mentioned, but always in diminished terms, complementary rather than equal, secondary rather than central. For American commanders reading these accounts, the message could not have been clearer. British narratives would forever center on British accomplishments, regardless of the objective evidence. The Sicily campaign left scars that never fully healed. American commanders had proven that their forces could match the British in both operational tempo and combat effectiveness. Yet recognition from their British counterparts remained grudging, conditional, and at times condescending. Montgomery, in particular, appeared constitutionally incapable of acknowledging that American commanders might possess skills comparable to his own, or that American forces could deserve credit proportionate to their contributions. 2 incidents during the campaign further poisoned the relationship. On August 3rd and again on August 10th, Patton struck hospitalized soldiers he accused of cowardice, triggering a scandal that would shadow his career. When word reached Montgomery, his response was coldly dismissive. Patton's conduct, he implied, confirmed British assumptions about American indiscipline and emotional volatility. In Montgomery's view, a proper British commander would never lose control in such a fashion. The second incident, almost comical in its triviality, revealed the casual disrespect underpinning Montgomery's treatment of American counterparts. A young British lieutenant, dispatched by Montgomery as a liaison officer to Patton's headquarters, arrived with nothing more than a string-tied suitcase and a shabby appearance, enraging Patton. Earlier, Patton had sent Montgomery a full liaison team, colonel, major, and complete communications section, yet received in return a single junior officer with inadequate resources. Patton sent the lieutenant back with a note. He could not permit boys in his headquarters. The episode was minor in operational terms, yet deeply symbolic. Patton commanded an army equal in size and importance to Montgomery's 8th Army. Professional courtesy dictated that liaison officers of appropriate rank and competence should accompany him. Montgomery's failure to provide them signaled that he viewed 7th Army as inherently subordinate, regardless of official command arrangements. As Allied planners turned toward the invasion of Italy and, ultimately, Operation Overlord, the cross-channel assault on France, one fact had become undeniable. Bernard Montgomery regarded himself as the preeminent Allied battlefield commander, expecting deference from American subordinates as a matter of course. That American commanders increasingly saw Montgomery as the primary obstacle to true Anglo-American partnership seemed either unnoticed by the British Field Marshal or simply irrelevant to him. September 1st, 1944, northern France. The Allied breakout from Normandy had shattered German defenses, sending Wehrmacht forces into a panicked eastward retreat. Paris had been liberated on August 25th amid scenes of jubilation, seemingly confirming that the war's end was near. From Normandy's beaches to the forests of Belgium, Allied armies pursued a defeated enemy across terrain that just months earlier had seemed impregnable. Victory, perhaps by Christmas, appeared tantalizingly close. For Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, recently promoted and basking in the glory of Normandy, the moment demanded bold, decisive action. Having commanded all Allied ground forces during the invasion, and with a string of victories in North Africa and Sicily behind him, Montgomery now saw an opportunity to end the war with a single, dramatic thrust. Yet September 1st also brought a change that Montgomery met with barely concealed fury. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, assumed personal control of all Allied ground forces. Montgomery, who had exercised operational command over both British and American armies in Normandy, was now reduced to commanding the 21st Army Group, the British and Canadian forces fighting in northwest Europe. His American counterpart, General Omar Bradley, assumed command of the 12th Army Group, encompassing the American 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies. The change was inevitable, but Montgomery's resentment would simmer for months to come. By late 1944, American forces in Europe dramatically outnumbered their British and Canadian counterparts. American logistics sustained the Allied advance. American air power dominated the skies. American industry provided the material backbone for victory. Politically, the reality was undeniable. Command of the coalition now rested on American shoulders by both numbers and necessity. Montgomery understood the politics, but he neither accepted their necessity nor grasped their implications. In his view, dispersing command authority across multiple headquarters diluted the decisive leadership required to win. Eisenhower, for all his political skill, lacked the battlefield experience to direct ground operations effectively, Montgomery argued. The Supreme Commander's role, he insisted with growing intensity, should be limited to coordination, political and logistical. Operational command, the crucial authority on the battlefield, belonged in the hands of a single ground forces commander with proven credentials. The obvious beneficiary of this logic was Montgomery himself, but the field marshal framed it as military necessity rather than personal ambition. Eisenhower's plan to advance into Germany on a broad front with multiple armies attacking simultaneously, Montgomery denounced as strategically unsound. It dispersed resources, prevented concentration of force, and guaranteed that the war would drag into 1945. Montgomery's alternative was both bold and characteristically self-centered. Rather than a broad-front advance, he proposed a single powerful thrust into northern Germany. This offensive would cross the Rhine, seize the Ruhr industrial heartland, and drive on to Berlin before German forces could organize coherent defenses. Naturally, Montgomery would command the decisive operation, with American forces assigned to supporting roles and flank protection. The military merits of this plan were questionable. A narrow thrust deep into Germany would create a dangerously elongated salient, vulnerable to counterattack. It would require abandoning operations elsewhere, enabling German forces to concentrate against the advance. Success depended on capturing bridges intact and maintaining supply lines across hundreds of miles of contested territory. Most critically, it assumed German resistance had collapsed to the point that a rapid advance could meet minimal opposition. Politically, the implications were unmistakable. Montgomery was essentially asking American leaders to subordinate their armies to British command for an operation that would ensure British forces, under British leadership, delivered the war's decisive blow. He was demanding that American troops act as his shield while the British field marshal claimed ultimate victory, and in effect that Eisenhower surrender operational control to a subordinate who openly disdained his strategic judgment. Eisenhower, seeking to balance military necessities with coalition politics, compromised. He would not concentrate all forces for Montgomery's northern thrust, but he would grant priority for supplies and authorize a limited operation to seize key bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands. Designated Operation Market Garden, the plan called for 3 airborne divisions to capture bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. British ground forces would then advance rapidly across the captured bridges, establish a Rhine bridgehead, and position themselves for subsequent operations into Germany. For American commanders, Bradley and Patton in particular, Montgomery's scheme confirmed their worst suspicions. Once again, the field marshal was attempting to relegate American forces to supporting roles while British troops pursued glory. He demanded resources that might otherwise sustain American advances in central France, proposing an operation whose risks seemed wildly disproportionate to the potential gains. Patton, commanding Third Army pushing toward Germany through eastern France, exploded when he learned fuel allocations were being shifted to Montgomery. His army had proven in August that aggressive American operations could advance faster and farther than the cautious movements of British forces. Third Army was approaching the German border, and the Rhine-Yet Eisenhower was halting American operations to supply a British field marshal whose record suggested methodical caution rather than operational boldness. Bradley, normally measured and diplomatic, shared Patton's frustration. Montgomery requested resources, threatened dire consequences if denied, and received priority regardless of American needs or achievements. Coalition politics, Bradley recognized, guaranteed that British demands would carry weight, even as American forces provided the lion's share of combat power. September 17, 1944, the Netherlands, Operation Market Garden, began as the largest airborne operation in history. Over 35,000 American and British paratroopers descended from transport aircraft and gliders into Dutch fields, tasked with seizing key bridges before German forces could destroy them. British ground forces, led by XSKX Corps, pushed north along a single highway, racing to relieve the airborne units before German counterattacks could overwhelm them. The operation failed catastrophically, Intelligence had detected German armor near Arnhem, the northernmost objective, but these warnings were dismissed. Airborne troops landed too far from their targets, giving the Germans time to organize defenses. The single highway became a death trap. British armor could neither advance quickly nor maneuver off roads hemmed in by marshlands. Far from collapsing, German resistance hardened as commanders rushed reinforcements to meet the threat. At Arnhem Bridge, British paratroopers under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost held one end against overwhelming odds, expecting relief that never came. XXX Corps, stalled by German counterattacks and unable to bypass destroyed bridges, never reached them. By September 25th, Operation Market Garden was abandoned. Over 17,000 Allied troops had been killed, wounded, or captured, including roughly 6,400 paratroopers at Arnhem, most now dead or prisoners. The failure was total. The Rhine remained uncrossed. German defenses in the Netherlands solidified. Allied momentum, which had seemed unstoppable in early September, evaporated along what the British would later call Hell's Highway. Montgomery's gamble had blown up spectacularly. American reactions were a mixture of vindication and outrage. Patton and Bradley had opposed Market Garden from the outset, arguing that its risks far outweighed its potential gains. They had urged that the resources Montgomery demanded would be better employed sustaining American advances into Germany. Their objections had been ignored, dismissed in favor of political considerations and Montgomery's relentless certainty. Now, with the operation's failure undeniable, American commanders felt a grim satisfaction, proof that their judgment had been sound. Yet satisfaction was quickly drowned by fury at Montgomery's response. Rather than taking responsibility for an operation he conceived, planned, and commanded, he declared Market Garden 90% successful. Eindhoven and Nijmegen had been captured, he argued. Substantial Dutch territory had been liberated. Arnhem, the operation's primary objective, had not fallen, but that, in his account, was a minor setback in an otherwise triumphant campaign. The claim was breathtakingly dishonest. Market Garden's purpose had been to establish a Rhine bridgehead. That objective had failed. Over 17,000 Allied soldiers had been lost for no strategic gain, and Montgomery proclaimed victory. American commanders recognized the maneuver for what it was. Montgomery protecting his reputation at the expense of truth. When he succeeded, credit was his alone. When operations faltered, explanations involved inadequate resources, insufficient support, or others' failures. Personal responsibility for setbacks was conspicuously absent from Montgomery's narrative. His most egregious offense came next. After Market Garden, as Allied operations transitioned to grinding advances against strengthened German defenses, Montgomery began publicly criticizing Eisenhower's strategy. In the press and in signals to Churchill, he argued that the broad front approach had squandered a chance for decisive victory. Had his plan been adopted, he claimed, and had he been given the authority and resources he requested, the war would already be over. The critique ignored inconvenient facts. Montgomery had been allocated substantial resources, and Market Garden failed due to flawed planning, intelligence failures, and underestimating German capabilities, not lack of support. For American commanders, this deflection confirmed what they had long suspected. Montgomery would never acknowledge personal error. Every setback became someone else's failure. Every success was his alone. The pattern was not mere vanity. It revealed a corrosive incapacity for honest self-assessment, a trait that made him both invaluable and dangerous to Allied unity. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. At dawn, German forces launched their last great offensive in the West, striking through the Ardennes in a desperate gamble to split Allied armies and seize the port of Antwerp. The assault achieved complete surprise, smashing into thinly held American positions and creating a bulge in the lines that gave the battle its name. For 10 days, the outcome teetered as German spearheads drove toward the Meuse River, threatening to fracture Allied defenses and prolong the war indefinitely. The Battle of the Bulge became Montgomery's finest and worst moment simultaneously. Militarily, his performance was exemplary. When Eisenhower transferred command of the American 1st and 9th Armies to him on December 20th, Montgomery imposed order on confused defensive operations almost instantly. He positioned British reserves to defend the Meuse crossings, bringing structure to a chaotic front. Montgomery had, in truth, coordinated American counterattacks. Under conditions of genuine crisis, he demonstrated the skill that had earned Britain's admiration. Yet his conduct after the Battle of the Bulge sowed bitterness that would linger for decades. January 7, 1945. With German forces in full retreat and Allied victory effectively assured, Montgomery held a press conference ostensibly to praise American troops and defend Eisenhower. What emerged, however, was a master class in self-promotion disguised as gracious compliment. He began by acknowledging the fighting qualities of American soldiers, but almost immediately pivoted to describe his own actions as decisive interventions that had supposedly saved them from disaster. As soon as I saw what was happening, Montgomery explained, I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans reached the Meuse, they would certainly not cross that river. He continued, detailing how he had tidied up the battlefield, anticipated developments, and ensured balanced dispositions. The battle, he concluded, had been most interesting, possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. Throughout the recitation, British actions were highlighted, Montgomery's brilliance emphasized, and American commanders were conspicuously absent. It was a calculated insult disguised as praise. He lauded American soldiers while implying that they had been saved by his superior leadership. He credited American courage while suggesting that American commanders had been overwhelmed until British professionalism imposed order. He framed a desperate defensive battle won primarily by American units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne and Patton's rapid counterattack from the south as a triumph of Montgomery alone. American reaction was explosive. Bradley, reading the press reports, felt profound betrayal. Montgomery had commanded 2 American armies for barely 3 weeks. Those armies had fought magnificently, holding against overwhelming odds until German momentum exhausted itself. Patton's Third Army had executed a brilliant winter counterattack, pivoting 90 degrees to relieve Bastogne. American soldiers had paid in blood to defeat Hitler's final gamble. Yet Montgomery's narrative minimized their contributions, elevating his own role to central importance. This was not mere vanity. It was historical theft, an attempt to recast an American victory as a British rescue. And it was, American commanders realized, Montgomery's authentic view. He genuinely believed his intervention had saved American forces and saw nothing inappropriate in claiming credit for a battle won overwhelmingly by troops he had commanded for less than a month. The press conference triggered a near-command crisis. Bradley, furious beyond diplomatic restraint, called Eisenhower. He could not, he declared, serve under Montgomery if the field marshal were to command American forces permanently. If Eisenhower intended such a course, Bradley would resign. The ultimatum was no idle threat. Normally diplomatic, Bradley had reached his breaking point. Eisenhower, recognizing that Allied unity hung by a thread, moved quickly to calm him while privately drafting a message to the combined chiefs of staff. He would request Montgomery's relief unless the field marshal apologized and ceased public criticisms. The war had been won, but whether the alliance survived that victory remained uncertain. The crisis, resolved only after intense British pressure, forced Montgomery to acknowledge his error. On January 12th, he wrote to Eisenhower, expressing regret and admitting that his press conference had caused offense. To Bradley, he sent a conciliatory letter praising American troops and expressing gratitude for the honor of temporarily commanding them. The letters were gracious, apparently sincere, but largely irrelevant. The damage was done. American commanders now understood with absolute clarity that Montgomery would never see them as genuine partners. Every operation would be filtered through his assessment of how it affected his reputation. Every failure would be blamed on insufficient support or others' errors. Every success would validate his wisdom. The pattern was fixed, predictable, and intolerable. By early 1945, the balance of forces in Europe had shifted decisively toward American predominance. Montgomery's pretensions to battlefield supremacy were no longer merely irritating. They had become operationally counterproductive. American armies numbered over 60 divisions. British and Canadian forces fewer than 20. American logistics sustained the Allied effort. American air power dominated the European skies. Yet Montgomery continued to behave as if British guidance must shape American strength. The contradiction reflected deeper tensions in Anglo-American relations. Britain, exhausted by 5 years of war and facing post-war economic collapse, struggled to accept that its global predominance had ended. The United States, emerging as the world's dominant power, was learning that military might carry political responsibilities that American traditions had not prepared it to assume. Montgomery's inability to adjust to these realities made him a symbol of Britain's difficulty in accepting diminished status. Winston Churchill, observing the press conference debacle, recognized the danger. On January 18th, speaking in Parliament, he carefully calibrated his words to repair Allied relations. The Battle of the Bulge, he stated unequivocally, was predominantly an American battle, an American victory, and would be remembered as an ever-famous American triumph. British forces had played a supporting role, as coalition partners should. The speech was diplomatic necessity, correcting Montgomery's narrative and acknowledging military realities. But it also signaled a larger truth. The remaining campaigns of the war would be primarily American endeavors. British forces would participate, contribute, and share in the victories. But American commanders would increasingly dictate strategy, direct operations, and claim the credit that their forces' predominance demanded. Montgomery, increasingly isolated by his own behavior and rendered largely irrelevant in a theater dominated by American armies, spent the final months of the war commanding 21st Army Group in Northern Europe. His operations remained professional, his tactical judgment sound, but the rupture with American commanders never healed. Bradley avoided him. Patton despised him. Eisenhower tolerated him because political and coalition necessities demanded it, but never again trusted his judgment or motives. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The European war was over. Victory belonged to a coalition that had overcome not only Nazi Germany, but also the internal divisions that had repeatedly threatened to tear it apart. In the euphoria of peace, old conflicts were temporarily submerged. Montgomery received accolades from the grateful British public, while American commanders returned home to celebrations that recognized their achievements. Yet history would not let the disputes remain buried. Montgomery's own memoirs, published in 1958, reignited controversy by criticizing Eisenhower and implicitly claiming that his strategic vision had been superior. Eisenhower, then President of the United States, broke off personal contact, refusing to correspond with a former colleague seemingly intent on refighting battles from a vanished war. Bradley's 1951 memoir meticulously documented instances in which Montgomery had undermined Allied operations. Patton's posthumously published diary revealed the depth of his contempt for the British Field Marshal. American histories of the war, drawing on these accounts and official records, presented Montgomery as a figure of contradictions, talented but difficult, brilliant yet insufferable, a commander whose contributions were real, but whose personality made him a liability to coalition warfare. British historians defended him, emphasizing his methodical approach, concern for casualties, and strategic sophistication. They noted that Montgomery never lost a major battle after assuming command in North Africa, highlighting his role in the planning and preparation that made D-Day successful. They suggested American criticisms reflected jealousy of British professionalism and resentment of British military traditions. The debate continued for decades after the participants' deaths. Scholars argued over Montgomery's true contributions, whether American frustrations were justified, and how personalities affected military operations. Some concluded that he was a great commander, poorly suited to coalition warfare. Others suggested American commanders, lacking his experience, resented his superior judgment. Still others argued the tensions were inevitable when proud nations attempt to cooperate in existential struggle. Beneath the historiographical debates lay a simpler truth, one that American commanders understood with crystalline clarity. Bernard Montgomery, for all his talents, could not treat American forces as equals. Whether this reflected personal arrogance, cultural prejudice, or Britain's desire to maintain fading global supremacy remained debatable. What was indisputable, his conduct poisoned Allied relationships and created unnecessary obstacles to coalition warfare. The American experience with Montgomery left lessons that outlived the war. Future coalition operations would be structured to prevent personality conflicts from undermining military effectiveness. Command arrangements would ensure proportional representation and prevent any nation from dominating through superior confidence or historical precedent. American military culture internalized wariness of allies who confused partnership with subordination. For the Americans who fought alongside Montgomery from Tunisia to Germany, the field marshal represented what they believed they had left behind in 776, the assumption that British wisdom must guide American strength, that colonial enthusiasm required metropolitan sophistication, that New World energy needed Old World experience to avoid disaster. They discovered that battlefield excellence, industrial might, and military success could not overcome cultural assumptions rooted in centuries of British global dominance. Montgomery never understood this. To his death in 1976, he maintained that his wartime conduct had been entirely appropriate, his criticisms justified, and his strategic vision superior to all alternatives. He remained convinced that Eisenhower's leadership had been inadequate, that American commanders lacked his professional competence, and that the war could have ended sooner had his advice been followed. American commanders who survived him offered a very different verdict. They acknowledged his tactical skill but questioned his strategic judgment. They praised his careful preparation but noted that wars are won by boldness as well as caution. They conceded his concern for casualties but observed that his caution sometimes allowed enemies to escape destruction. They concluded, nearly unanimously, that Montgomery's personality made coalition warfare more difficult than necessary. The final assessment belonged to Eisenhower, writing years later. He acknowledged Montgomery's abilities, but stressed the field marshal's complete inability to understand the political dimensions of coalition command. Montgomery was a man of undeniable military talent, Eisenhower concluded, but his lack of diplomatic sensitivity rendered him unsuited for senior command in Allied operations. It was perhaps the most devastating critique possible, not that Montgomery lacked military competence, but that his virtues were overwhelmed by vices that undermined the very cause he served. In coalition warfare, where personality affects effectiveness as profoundly as tactics or strategy, Montgomery's incapacity to treat allies as partners made him not merely difficult, but dangerous. The Americans had learned this lesson through bitter experience, from the North African sands to the mud of Germany. They discovered that military alliances require more than shared enemies. They demand respect, recognition, and the willingness to subordinate ego to collective purpose. Alliances demand more than coordination. They demand mutual respect, acknowledgement of partners' contributions, and a willingness to subordinate ego to the collective purpose. Montgomery, for all his other qualities, could not meet these requirements, and in that failure lay the answer to why the Americans despised him. It was not simply because he was British, nor merely because he was cautious. It was because he made them feel like colonial auxiliaries in a war they were winning, soldiers whose blood mattered but whose judgment did not, allies valued only insofar as they facilitated British glory. That memory endured. It outlasted Montgomery himself, outlasted the generation that had served with him, and outlasted even the Cold War alliances forged from wartime cooperation. It remained a permanent reminder that technical excellence cannot substitute for human respect, that battlefield brilliance is hollow if it alienates those whose cooperation victory requires. Bernard Montgomery was many things. Brilliant tactician, meticulous planner, British hero. But to the Americans who fought alongside him, he was also a cautionary tale-proof of the limits of military genius, divorced from diplomatic wisdom. The question was never whether Americans recognized Montgomery's talents. They did. The question was whether Montgomery could recognize theirs. He could not. And in that failure of imagination lay the roots of a bitterness no amount of shared victory could ever erase.